On August 30th, 1954, the French National Assembly held a vote that almost nobody today remembers. The result was 319 to 264, 31 abstentions, a margin of just 55 votes. And with that single vote, the most ambitious political experiment in European history was killed before it could even begin. What France rejected that day was not a trade agreement. It was not a customs union. It was not the slow technical integration that would eventually become the modern European Union. It was something far more radical. A genuine federal European state, with its own army, its own government, its own parliament, and its own direct constitutional authority over 6 founding nations. A United States of Europe in everything but name. 4 other countries had already said yes. West Germany, Italy, Belgium, the Netherlands, Luxembourg, and all ratified. Only France remained. And on that August afternoon in 1954, a coalition of Gaullists who could not stomach German soldiers under any flag but their own, and French communists who answered to Moscow, combined to destroy it. The pro-Europeans gave that day a name. They called it Le Crime du 30 août, the crime of 30 August, because they knew even then what had just been lost. But what if 28 deputies had voted differently? What if the coalition had fractured by just a handful of votes? What if France on that day had said yes? Europe as we know it would not exist. In its place would stand something else entirely, something larger, something more powerful, something far more consequential for the balance of world power than anything we have today. A single nation, stretching from the Atlantic coast of France to the border of communist Czechoslovakia, with a single army, a single foreign policy, a single seat at every negotiating table on Earth, and the 20th century would have unfolded in a fundamentally different direction. Before we dive into that alternate timeline, we need to understand exactly what France rejected that day, because the scale of it was extraordinary. And the fact that Europe came this close to federalism in 1954 is something most people today genuinely do not know. The story begins not in Paris or Berlin, but on a prison island in the Tyrrhenian Sea. In the summer of 1941, his name was Altiero Spinelli, and he was writing on cigarette papers. Mussolini had imprisoned him for communist activities, exiled him to the island of Ventetine, a rock barely 2 kilometers long off the coast of Naples. It was there, with nowhere to go and nothing but time, that Spinelli wrote the document that would define European federalism for the next 80 years. The Ventetine Manifesto, hidden in the false bottom of a tin box, and smuggled to the Italian resistance by his colleague's wife. His argument was simple and devastating. Europe kept destroying itself in world wars not because of militarism or ideology, but because of the absolute sovereignty of the nation-state. The only solution was federation. A single European government with a single army. A constitution that no single nation could veto. This was written in 1941, while Nazi Germany occupied most of the continent. By the end of the war, Spinelli's ideas had spread further than anyone could have predicted. In September 1946, Winston Churchill stood at the University of Zurich and delivered a speech that electrified the political class. He said, "We must build a kind of United States of Europe." A partnership between France and Germany was, he argued, the only way to prevent another continental war. Then he closed with a line that has echoed ever since. "Let Europe arise." Crucially, Churchill saw Britain as a sponsor of this project, not a member. Britain would support it, Britain would not join it, and then came the men who would actually build it. Jean Monnet had a different approach to Spinelli. Where Spinelli wanted revolution, Monnet wanted architecture. Quiet, patient, brick-by-brick architecture. His strategy was to integrate Europe in small technical steps that, once made, could not be reversed. Start with coal and steel, the raw materials of war. Pool them under a supranational authority, and France and Germany cannot go to war with each other without going to war with themselves. On May 9, 1950, the French Foreign Minister Robert Schuman presented the plan that Monnet had drafted: the European Coal and Steel Community. 6 nations signed on: Germany, France, Italy, Belgium, the Netherlands, Luxembourg. The Treaty of Paris followed in 1951. And then, in 1950, Korea exploded. The Korean War terrified Western Europe. If communist North Korea could attack South Korea with Stalin's blessing, what was stopping Soviet forces from rolling across the North German plain? American pressure on Europe became immediate and intense. Germany had to be rearmed. There was no other way to defend the continent but rearm Germany, only 5 years after the end of the Second World War. The country that had occupied France twice in 30 years. The country whose soldiers had killed millions of Europeans. The political impossibility of that was obvious to everyone. And so, the French proposed something extraordinary. If Germany had to rearm, let it rearm inside a European army. Not a German army. Not a NATO command structure with German divisions. A genuinely supranational European force, with a European defense minister, a European military budget, a European chain of command, national contingents fully integrated at the division level, so that no member state could unilaterally withdraw its soldiers. The proposal came from French Prime Minister René Pleven in October 1950. The drafting was largely Monnet's, and alongside it came something even more ambitious. If Europe was going to have a common army, it needed a common government to command it. A European political community. A bicameral federal structure, one with a directly elected People's Chamber, and a European Executive Council. In other words, a state. The treaty was signed on 27 May 1952. West Germany ratified, the Netherlands ratified, Belgium ratified, Luxembourg ratified. Italy was waiting only for France to move, and then came that vote on August 30th, 1954, and everything fell apart. I'm sorry for the quick intermission, but by far most of you aren't subscribed. To keep up to date with all latest releases, consider doing so. Thank you. Now let us imagine the vote had gone the other way. The margin, remember, was 55 votes. In a chamber of 627 deputies, that is not a comfortable defeat. It is a cliffhanger. The French Communist Party voted as a bloc on Moscow's instructions. The Gaullists voted against Germany out of nationalist conviction, but between those two wings of opposition sat dozens of socialists and radicals who agonized over the vote until the final hour. A different atmosphere in the chamber. A stronger speech from Pierre Mendès France, who governed without committing either way. A different communist line from Moscow in the weeks before the vote. And 28 deputies flipped their position. France says yes. Italy says yes within a week. The European defense community enters into force by the end of 1954. And immediately, the consequences are enormous. The integrated European army becomes operational across 1955 and 1956. German divisions take the field for the first time since the war, but they wear European uniform under a European flag, commanded by a European general staff in which French officers dominate at the top. The German generals accept this because it is the only way Germany returns to military respectability. The French accept it because French officers get the senior commands, and the Americans love it, because for the first time the European half of NATO is actually paying for its own defense. By 1957, the European political community has been drafted and ratified. Its structure is broadly the one Paul-Henri Spaak's drafting committee produced in March 1953. A directly elected People's Chamber of 268 members, a Senate of 87, indirectly elected by national parliaments, a European Executive Council with real constitutional authority, a Court of Justice with jurisdiction over the whole federation, and crucially, the ECSC, the EDC, and the EPC are merged into a single federal institution. Not 3 overlapping communities, one government. This is not the modern European Union. This is something qualitatively different. The EU today is a treaty organization between sovereign states. The United States of Europe in this timeline is a state. It has its own citizenship, its own passport, its own federal courts that can overrule national courts on matters of union competence, its own taxes collected directly, not as contributions from member governments. France keeps its constitutional presidency, but it is now a federal vice presidency beneath a European executive. Germany remains divided, the eastern half under Soviet occupation, but West Germany is now a constituent state of the Federation, not a sovereign nation. Italy gains access to the Franco-German industrial core. The Benelux countries, which had feared being crushed between Paris and Bonn, get what they always wanted: a federal structure that protects small states through constitutional voting rules rather than raw power politics. And by the late 1950s, the Federation has 6 members, an integrated military of roughly 40 divisions, and a combined industrial base larger than the Soviet Union's. Which brings us to the first great test: de Gaulle. Charles de Gaulle returns to power in 1958, summoned by France to resolve the Algerian crisis. Historically, he then spent the next 11 years deliberately obstructing European integration, vetoing British membership twice, triggering the empty chair crisis in 1965, pursuing an independent French nuclear force to escape what he saw as American dominance. But in this timeline, de Gaulle inherits a constitutional situation he cannot simply undo. France has been part of the Federation for 4 years. French officers are embedded in the European military command structure. The People's Chamber in Strasbourg has been legislating since 1957. To pull France out now would require not a diplomatic rupture but a constitutional secession. And the French economy by 1958 has already begun to deeply integrate with the German one. De Gaulle does what de Gaulle does. He fights, he obstructs, he demands French preeminence within the Federation rather than outside it. He tries to shift the Federation in an intergovernmental direction through the Fouché Plan, roughly as he did historically. In this timeline, that plan has a different character. Not an alternative to the communities, but an attempt to rebalance an existing federal structure in favor of national capitals. The outcome is messy. De Gaulle probably does succeed in slowing the consolidation of federal authority during his tenure. The Federation's foreign policy remains partially fragmented through the 1960s, with France often pursuing its own line on Algeria, on NATO, on the dollar. The French force de frappe develops anyway, because de Gaulle builds it. But it develops as a French nuclear weapon within the Federation, with all the contradictions that implies. A federal state that cannot fully control its own nuclear arsenal. This is a tension that the Federation never fully resolves, and it matters a great deal later on. The British question also looks entirely different. Churchill's original 1946 vision had Britain supporting Europe from outside, and this is the position London maintains. There is no British application to join in 1961 because there is nothing to join in the ordinary sense. The Federation is a sovereign state. Joining would mean dissolving British sovereignty. No conservative government and no Labour government is going to propose that. Britain maintains the Commonwealth orientation, the special relationship with America, and in the position of interlocutor rather than participant. The consequences for Britain are complex. On one hand, Britain escapes the decades of internal conflict over European membership that historically consumed its politics from the 1970s onwards. There is no Brexit because there is nothing to Brexit from. On the other hand, Britain's industrial decline, already visible by 1960, is accelerated. European industries, protected by a single large internal market and supported by federal investment, outcompete British ones systematically through the 1960s and 1970s. By 1980, British GDP per capita is probably 15 to 20% below the Federation's average. And the question of whether to join becomes the dominant debate in British politics. Now we come to the geopolitical consequence that rearranges everything: the Cold War. The Soviet Union in 1955 is confronted with something it has never had to deal with before: a unified Western European state, armed, integrated, and backed by the United States. The Kremlin's entire post-war strategy had been premised on European fragmentation. A Germany that could be neutralized, a France that could be peeled away, and Italy with a massive communist party that might one day take power through the ballot box. All of those calculations collapse when Western Europe becomes a single state. Moscow's response is predictable. It tightens control over the Warsaw Pact. The Hungarian Revolution of 1956 is crushed even more brutally because the Soviets cannot afford any sign of weakness on their western flank. The Berlin situation, already tense, becomes more dangerous. The Berlin Wall probably still goes up in 1961, perhaps earlier because the East German state faces even greater demographic hemorrhage toward the prosperous Federal West. Where it matters most is in the structure of the arms race. The Federation develops its own military-industrial complex that rivals the American one. By the mid-1960s, the European Army fields roughly 50 divisions, an air force of 4,000 combat aircraft, and a Mediterranean fleet significantly larger than anything France and Italy could field separately. The combined defense budget approaches American levels because the Federation is not free-riding on NATO. It is NATO's European half in a formal sense, but it pays its own way. This changes American strategic calculations profoundly, and the burden-sharing debates that historically poisoned transatlantic relations for decades simply do not exist. American military presence in Europe is probably smaller, not larger than it was historically. Perhaps 100,000 U.S. troops rather than 300,000. The Federation provides the ground forces. America provides the nuclear umbrella, at least until the Federation develops its own. And here is where it gets particularly interesting, because the nuclear question in the United States of Europe is constitutionally unresolved in a way it cannot remain. France builds the bomb anyway, as de Gaulle insists, but it builds it within the Federation. By the early 1970s, after de Gaulle is gone, there is enormous pressure to federalize that arsenal. The Germans want a seat at the nuclear table. The Italians want one. The constitutional logic of a federal state with nuclear weapons controlled by a single constituent member is untenable. By around 1975, likely after significant political crisis, the French nuclear force is brought under federal command, with French officers retaining operational control, but with launch authority vested in the federal executive. The Federation becomes, formally, the world's third nuclear superpower, and the Cold War becomes a tripolar rather than bipolar contest. The economic consequences are equally transformative. Without internal borders, without customs barriers, without currency fluctuations between its constituent regions, the Federation industrializes faster than historically occurred. The German Wirtschaftswunder spreads outward. Italian industry in the north prospers, though the southern question remains intractable. France retains a more dirigist economic culture than Germany would prefer, and these internal debates over economic philosophy consume federal politics through the 1960s. A common European currency, which historically arrived in 1999, arrives in this timeline perhaps in the mid-1960s or early 1970s. Call it the European mark or some other name. By 1975, it is a serious rival to the dollar as a reserve currency. Yeah, the Bretton Woods collapse in 1971 plays out differently because Europe is not a fragmented group of national central banks. It is a single monetary authority. American economic dominance is not displaced. American technological leadership in the 1960s is too great for that. Silicon Valley still happens. The computer revolution still happens. But the Federation is a genuine economic peer by 1980. Not a collection of medium-sized powers that collectively add up to less than the sum of their parts. For the wider world, this matters enormously. The developing world has a second pole of development finance. African decolonization, which occurred mostly in the 1960s, plays out with European colonial powers acting through a federal framework rather than unilaterally. France's disastrous Algerian War probably still happens. Yet because de Gaulle still inherits that crisis in 1958, But the shape of post-colonial Africa, and particularly the persistence of French economic dominance through the France-Afrique system, looks rather different when the metropole is a federation rather than a single nation. Japan's rise in the 1970s and 80s is complicated by the existence of a European economic bloc that can respond to competitive pressure collectively, rather than through separate national trade policies. The Plaza Accord of 1985, which historically forced a revaluation of the yen, has a European partner negotiating as one voice. Japan faces two superpowers in trade policy, not one in a fragmented Europe. And then we reach the moment where everything accelerates. 1989, the Soviet bloc collapses. The Federation in this timeline is the dominant actor in determining what happens next in Eastern Europe. The United States is distant, the Soviet Union is imploding, West Germany is a federal state, not a sovereign nation, so German reunification is not a German question. It is a federal question, and the Federation has to decide what to do with the collapsing states to its east. The likely outcome is ambitious enlargement. Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, the Baltic states, Romania, Bulgaria, all apply for membership through the 1990s. The Federation absorbs them over roughly a 15-year period, perhaps slightly faster than the historical EU did. The conditions for membership are more stringent because membership is statehood, not treaty accession. Serious constitutional reform is required. Economies must be integrated, not just aligned. By around 2005 or 2010, the Federation stretches from the Atlantic to the Black Sea, comprising perhaps 25 to 27 constituent states. Its population exceeds 500 million. Its GDP rivals or exceeds the United States. Its military is the second most capable on Earth after America's. Russia, in this timeline, has a much more troubled relationship with Europe. Not because the Federation is more aggressive, but because it is simply larger and stronger and on Russia's border. Moscow's sense of encirclement is sharper. The wars of the 2000s and 2010s, the Ukrainian crisis in particular, unfold with a European federal state that has a unified foreign policy and a unified military. There is no Hungary to peel away. There is no Orban to weaponize. The hybrid warfare strategies Russia developed historically depended on European fragmentation. That fragmentation does not exist, which means Russia's options are narrower. And arguably, the catastrophic invasion of Ukraine that happened in our timeline in 2022 does not happen in this one. Not because Russia is less ambitious, but because the calculation is different. Attacking a European federation means attacking a peer military power, not a patchwork of national armies. By this point in the scenario, we are deep into the territory where concrete prediction becomes difficult. The butterfly effects have multiplied. Every decade of divergence compounds the uncertainty. But what we can say with reasonable confidence is what the world looks like in broad outline. The 21st century, in the timeline where France voted yes on August 30th, 1954, is a tripolar world rather than a bipolar one. The United States remains the dominant power, but not overwhelmingly. The Federation is an equal in economic terms, a near equal in military terms, and a genuine alternative pole of attraction for the developing world. China rises, as it did historically, but into a more crowded field of great powers. The unipolar American moment of the 1990s simply does not exist, because the Federation was always there to balance it. The internal tensions are real and unresolved. 24 languages, deep economic gaps between rich North and poorer South and East, national identities that remain primary for most citizens, with federal identity a thin layer on top. Illiberal governments that win elections in constituent states and challenge federal authority. The Federation manages these tensions mostly because it has institutional mechanisms that took 50 years to develop, but they remain sources of friction throughout. And here's where the counterfactual becomes genuinely uncomfortable. Because it is not clear that a United States of Europe is unambiguously better. On balance, probably yes. A unified Europe likely prevents the Balkan Wars of the 1990s, or at least intervenes earlier and more decisively. It probably prevents the Ukrainian catastrophe. It almost certainly prevents Brexit because there's nothing comparable for Britain to exit. But it also creates a more regimented continent. The extraordinary diversity of European political cultures, preserved in our timeline by the persistence of sovereign states, is flattened under a federal structure that homogenizes much faster than its architects anticipated. The intense democratic debates that define modern Europe. France's referendum culture, Italian coalition politics, German constitutional jurisprudence are subordinated to federal decision-making in Strasbourg. Something is gained, something is also lost. The French voters who said no to the European Constitution in 2005 and the Dutch voters who said no 3 days later were not wrong to hesitate. They could see the trade-offs. In this timeline, those voters never got the chance to hesitate. The Federation was built before referendum culture fully developed as a check on integration, and that too is a consequence worth thinking about carefully. For now, though, this is the end of the video. Thank you all for watching, and consider leaving a like and a comment as well as subscribing. If you've enjoyed this video, click the video on top to watch another in this series. If you've already seen it, I'm sure the bottom video is great too. Once again, thank you all for watching and goodbye.